Farm for Profit Podcast. Take a listen, have a blast. Farm for Profit Podcast. Learn about farming while having a laugh. Farm for Profit Podcast.
We're back with some more great insights as to how we can manage our nitrogen. And it's a pleasure of ours to have back on the podcast Andrew Luzum, one of the nitrogen stabilizer strategic account managers with Corteva. Welcome back to the podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having me back on.
A lot's changed and a lot is the same since the last time that we talked. Got to do it in person last time. We get to hang out together virtually today. We had a great conversation with Taylor earlier this fall, focusing on fall applied nitrogen, but we've got some recent data that compares that to how spring applied works. What types of insights do you have to share with us on that side, Andrew?
Yeah, so even when we're applying a fall nitrogen stabilizer, the reality is hopefully we're applying nitrogen in the fall when it's below 50 degrees and the soil temps are falling. Realistically, we're not using the days of our stabilizer in the fall or hopefully the winter. It's actually we're using those days in the spring as soil temps warm up is really when we have nitrogen at risk of loss. And so that's why we want to make sure we're using nitrogen stabilizers both fall and spring. But realistically, you look at this last year, March was actually probably more of our nitrogen loss time period this year. And nobody thinks about that. March was relatively dry for most of the Corn Belt, but we were above average soil temps through the whole month of March. And really, you look at what happened this last year, we went through a warm March, we started to convert nitrogen, and then what happened in April and May? It started raining and it never stopped, right?
Yep.
And so when you look at, what we've seen in this last year, we had a lot of fall anhydrous trials with N-Serve out all over the Corn Belt this last year. When we compare those trials, where we had N-Serve, we were carrying an average of 5 to 11% more nitrogen in the ammonium form than in nitrate form. And especially when we look at competitive products like Centuro, we were carrying an average of 20% more nitrogen in the ammonium form. You may say, why is that important? When nitrogen is not in the ammonium form and it's in the nitrate form, it's totally susceptible to loss, right? And we know that 70% of our loss happens below ground. So that's why we want to make sure we're using proven products like N-Serve and Instinct.
Yeah, I wonder if all of our producers realize how important it is to have nitrogen in the ammonium form.
Yeah, it's a big conversation always is the fact that we have to remember that our soils are negatively charged, right? And so when it's in the ammonium form, it's in a positive form. It's reasons why we never talk about ammonium running down our waterways or what we're losing from leachate. It's always in the nitrate form. So not only is it more important that we're keeping it in the ammonium form for the environment, but it's also actually more plant efficient or energy efficient in the plant. So the corn actually does prefer corn or nitrogen in the ammonium form. And by doing that, it's going to allow it to have an easier uptake and hopefully more conversion towards yield, test weight, dry down, et cetera, in the fall.
Yeah, you mentioned that the soil's negatively charged, and it's not always something that's on the forefront of our listeners' minds, but we also know that soil profile is extremely complex. So do you have any suggestions this fall as we go through harvest as to what our listeners should be doing soil sampling-wise?
Yeah, so the soil, you talk CECs, organic matter, everything. Soils are very complex, right? And so we always recommend that we're pulling soil tests, especially within every 4 years at minimum. With that, we want to make sure that we've got adequate moisture. We're not overly too dry of soils that will throw soil skews or soil tests way off. The other thing is we want to make sure we're striving for accuracy and consistency when we look at these soil tests. We want to make sure we're getting good 6 to 8 inch cores. And we want to make sure we're pulling them and sending them to a good certified lab who's going to be running those results. I know that fall gets busy for a lot of growers. I think a lot of guys, even like ourselves, always think, we're going to get to that this fall and 80 other things become in the way. I always recommend too of hire somebody you can trust potentially to make sure that you're getting those soil tests pulled because it is important. You look at the economics in the farm economy we're in today, fertility really hasn't dropped in price, unlike what we've seen happen on the commodity side. And so we want to make sure that we are knowing what we're going to be putting out there this fall. There's a lot of guys looking at cutting back from a fertility perspective. I get it, but let's make sure we're dialed in and putting out what we absolutely are going to need to raise crop next year.
A lot of producers are in that drier area. We're looking on some pre-fall drought-like conditions that are in place. What is the solution if we want to be really protective of taking dry soil samples? Is there an option for us?
I mean, ideally we catch a little bit of rain. If we're not going to have rain, just make sure that when you are pulling soil cores that you're doing a really good job and actually getting a good 6 to 8 inch core. If a probe goes in and you pull it back out and you only have 4 inches, that's going to skew results. The other side of it is, take in for granted or into effect, if you are taking really dry soil samples and you're sending them in and, your last baseline soil test you had was maybe really on the wet side. You got to take in some factor of error there on what you're going to see results when you're looking at your overall soil test. So a lot of variability can come into play.
That's right. But as we get these soil samples, what do our listeners need to do with those results after they come back?
Yeah, so using a certified lab, they're going to help, give you those results and then help make recommendations. If you're not using a good certified lab that's helping you do that, please use a good local retailer who's, well aligned to be giving you or helping you with those results. I know Iowa State Extension also is really good at helping through those at times if guys need the additional help. But make sure you're using people around you, resources. Even folks like myself or other people that work for Corteva are happy to help, work through those recommendations.
So as we kind of elaborate on the fact that you mentioned producers might be cutting back a little bit this fall when it comes to maybe fertilizer and possibly even nitrogen plans specifically, what do we have to say about the myths around that being okay, or that's the only way we can save costs?
Yeah, I mean, I think as we look at around nitrogen being a cost saver, especially in this next year, probably isn't the reality. I think you guys just had Josh Linville on here a couple weeks ago and talk about how nitrogen prices are staying fairly strong and don't look like they're going to be too bearish here over the next year. So we want to make sure we're starting with a good nitrogen plan. I think, we talk 4Rs using the right rates, the right time, right source of product, in the right place. All of those factors come into effect. I still think that fall nitrogen is going to be one of our most efficient or cost-effective methods of getting nitrogen out on the acre this fall. But using a good proven stabilizer like N-Serve is an insurance policy for an expensive investment, right? I still look at a nitrogen investment on a corn acre this year is probably going to be one of our top 2 expenses, excluding land cost, right? So we still want to make sure we're doing a really good job around nitrogen management. You look at the weather patterns, everything we went through this past year, it's really easy to lose expensive investment if we're not doing the right thing by using a good stabilizer.
Yeah, because I know that's going to be running through all of the farmers' minds is maybe I don't spend money on a stabilizer and that's where I'm going to save costs. But that doesn't sound like the right way to go. You framed it up as an insurance.
Yeah, it's like an insurance policy, right? If we're not stabilizing nitrogen, it's just prone to loss. We know that 70% of our nitrogen loss basically happens below the soil level. And guys say, oh, okay, I can, cheat 20 pounds or I can exclude the nitrogen stabilizer, maybe, use an additional 20 pounds of nitrogen. We like to look at it like cows in a pasture, right? Cows are really expensive today as well. But if you got a hole in the fence in your pasture, do you fix the hole in your fence or do you just buy more cows, right? Yeah. The reality is we're going to fix that hole in the fence. We're not going to just keep buying more cows. It's really no different when we're talking about nitrogen stabilization.
What a great way to frame that up. And I know as you are in your role with Corteva, you get a lot of pushback. I mean, maybe not pushback, but maybe there's a lot of myths that are created. What are some other things that you can help debunk for our audience as we talk today?
Yeah, I think some other myth that we hear is nitrogen stabilizers tie up our nitrogen or make it not plain available, right? That's not the case at all. By keeping it in the ammonium form, we talked through that a little bit ago, but keeping it in the ammonium form, the plant can still utilize it in the ammonium form. It actually prefers it. So it's not tying up your nitrogen, but it's going to keep it there in the soil profile available when the plant does need it. We really look at corn needs, the majority of their uptake between V6 and tassel. So it's got to be there when the plant needs it.
Right.
And if it's lost before that, it's just a waste of money.
That's a good point. What about the myth around it's harmful for the soil? Not that it ties up nitrogen, but harmful in general.
Yeah, we've heard that before too, right? And we actually did a lot of work this last year with Trace Genomics, if you've ever heard of that company. Yeah. But they do a lot of biological testing, right? And tell you overall soil health, bacteria, et cetera. And we did a lot of this testing between where we have N-Serve and Instinct, where we don't have it. And the reality is we're not killing these bacteria. It is an AMO enzyme inhibitor, but we're not actually a bactericide. We're not killing these bacteria at the rates we're using commercially today.
Well, I'm glad that you got to share that with us. It's fascinating when you look at the world not only of agriculture in general, but then you expand it to social media and how things can continue to grow and share amongst producers. But it's nice to know that we can provide our listeners a little bit of insight, especially when it comes to this partnership with Corteva and making sure that we understand the products. Remind our listeners, what are the applications that Instinct and N-Serve apply and pair with in fall application?
Yeah, so as we look at fall applications, N-Serve is primarily used with just anhydrous ammonia. As we look at Instinct NextGen, it is utilized between UAN, urea, and manure. Manure is usually our main source of fall fertilizer that it goes out with. You look at the state of Iowa, about 25% of our acres in the state get a manure acre applied in the fall. And so we want to make sure that we're using a good proven product like Instinct in the fall. Especially when you look at like finishing hog manure, that's as good as a hydrous acre when you look at total pounds of nitrogen that a guy is applying on an acre. So not only do we want to do the right thing for the environment, but we do want to do the right thing for our pocketbook. And if we can keep that nitrogen there, get it in our corn crop next year, we're going to see it in added ROI.
And I love that that's how you framed it up, ROI, because a lot of our listeners know that that's extremely important, not only this year, but every single year. And now as harvest is beginning to wrap up, we enter into this winter season. What are some things we should be thinking about?
Yeah, I think as we get into the winter season, things that we're talking through or looking at is, if guys are running reduced nitrogen rates this fall, trying to save a little money, how do we look at split rates next spring? And what time do they make sense? What stabilizer makes sense with that pass? What rate of the stabilizer does it make sense to run with those? Those are all large things that we're looking at as we get through winter. The other thing is, as we talk through a lot of winter activities or different products or different stabilizers, we know that nitropyrin is 10 times more effective at least than DCD. We've seen that this last year as we talked through, the reasons why. DCD is water soluble. So when we got all that heavy rainfall this past year, we did watch it leach out in all of these trials that we have out across the Corn Belt. So those are just a few that we're really talking through this winter as we talk about as often, or nitropyrin. I think the other thing that we'll be talking quite a bit about is the yield results that we see out of these trials this year. The initial trials that are coming out have looked really, really promising, but it's not just this last year that we've seen that. These products have been out here. Nitropyrin's been out for over 40 years, thousands of trials, and we see a 7% increase in yield when we use it in the fall and a little over a 5% increase in yield when we use it in the spring. So by far, we'll be talking through that message all winter too.
That's really great. I just thought of this. We talked to Taylor about when we can start applying anhydrous this fall. We want it to be at a certain temperature and falling. But is there a cutoff this winter to where we should stop fall applied nitrogen?
I mean, if it's like last winter, there really never was a stop, right? I think we actually only had soils freeze for about 2 weeks last winter, and we had applications of nitrogen going on all last winter, February, March, etc. So realistically, there's not a stop unless you get frozen out. But really, the main key there is that we don't want to start applying. We want to be good stewards until 50 degrees and falling, and we make sure we wait for that time frame, right? Like I said, we talked earlier, everybody's got a lot going on in the fall. Mm-hmm. Don't rush out there with warm soils and do things that aren't good for the environment and our pocketbooks.
That's great. So as we wrap up our conversation, if somebody wants to learn more about nitrogen stabilizers and fall applied nitrogen, how best do they do that?
Yeah, they should be able to do that through their local retailer, to reach out to a local Corteva AgriScience rep. If they don't have success there, please just go to nitrogenstabilizers.com and you'll be able to see everything we've got going from a nitrogen stabilizer perspective here at Corteva.
That's great. Well, is there anything else you'd like to add before we wrap up our conversation today, Andrew?
No, I think, the biggest thing is I've been having a lot of discussions with manure this fall. Manure is going to have more value again this year than ever just because of the price of fertility products today. And so make sure you're thinking about using Instinct and manure this fall. Truly, we've seen a lot of success. Iowa State actually had a 3-year study paid for by Iowa Pork that carried an 18 bushel increase over that 3-year time period. Minnesota's done a couple year trials where they saw a 10 to 12 bushel return on theirs as well. So I would say the biggest one there is be thinking about your manure applications this fall and using a good proven product like Instinct NextGen.
Well, I appreciate you sharing that information. Also, again, reminder to listeners, this is Andrew Luzum. He's the Nitrogen Stabilizer Strategic Account Manager with Corteva. And one more time, how can our listeners learn more about nitrogen stabilizers or get some of their questions answered?
Yeah, reach out to the local Corteva AgriScience rep or just go to nitrogenstabilizers.com.
Awesome. Thanks for your time, Andrew.